In 2000, we started this journey, when we started to wonder why the advertising industry were talking about emotion as if it was one church and not about the people within the church, all the types of emotions, and trying to understand what the linkage is between making a customer angry, and we're going to have a look at some bank ads that make people angry, and ask ourselves, is that actually the objective that we're seeking? What's the relationship between individual emotions and business outcomes? And the reason that we've never been able to answer this question until now is because we've never been able to measure emotion. I think tonight for us is about reading the last rites on awareness, on the model like ADA, on any of those books, any of those biobehaviour books that talked about learn, feel, do, as if it was the only model. And that's when I did marketing, that was the model that I was taught. And we're going to open our minds to the methods that actually are changing people's behaviour and understand how we can get to those emotions. So, is this a new direction for our firm? No, this is exactly the path that we've been on forever. We're about two things: retention of existing customers and acquisition of new customers. And so that's the continuation of that same focus. And we think that this is really critical for acquisition of new customers. So the question that we've been seeking to answer is, how do we maximise retention through improving operational performance? And that's usually fallen into the bucket of customer satisfaction. And the other one that we've sought to answer year after year is, how do we maximise acquisition through what's basically about closing the perception experience gap?
What we want to understand is the role that emotion plays in choice. And so we know that rational thinking is still important, but what we want to be able to do is to update our existing models to take into account what we now know or what we're learning about the role emotion plays. So we're not saying that we can throw out everything we know and it's all about emotion. In fact, it's a combination of the two. So just to have a look at that slide, fundamentally what we're saying there is that, and Professor Roberts has talked about this as well, that every brand, when you're thinking about a purchase within a category, is going to elicit some thoughts, and it's also going to elicit some emotional response. And both of those together are going to influence our decision making. Thoughts can lead to an emotional response, emotions can lead to different thoughts, but the key is how they work together to influence our decision making. So I just want to spend a little moment on defining what an emotion is. Now this is quite important because one of the things that we may or may not be aware of is that when we're talking emotions generally in common everyday language, we might be talking about something a little bit different to what we're about to talk about. So we've based a lot of our work on the work of Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist who is essentially one of the key people in this area and one of the initial leaders in terms of thinking in this space. We break this into two key areas, which is beneath awareness and above awareness. I deliberately avoid using the term unconscious or non-conscious at the moment, and the main reason for that is I don't want us to get confused with other theories around unconscious, like the Freudian type of thing. So what I want to talk about is beneath awareness, which is basically things that happen without us being consciously aware versus things that happen where we're consciously aware of them. So a state of emotion. According to Damasio, a state of emotion is essentially a physiological response that happens to us as a result of a stimulus. That stimulus could be external, so it could be seeing a brand, it could be seeing a person, it could be seeing a product, but it's external, or the stimulus could be internal, so it could be a thought. A thought can trigger an emotion. But an emotion is a physiological response, it's something that we're not actually aware of. And that's the bit that can be a little bit, I guess, outside of what we're initially thinking. An emotion is pretty much something you cannot control. It happens due to a stimulus and we're not necessarily aware of it. What happens then is that emotion is then represented within our mind as a feeling. This still initially happens beneath awareness. So it's how our mind or our brain makes sense of what's happening to us, essentially, both our body and within our brain, so the different changes that happen neurologically, physiologically and chemically. So we have a feeling. Then we can become aware of the feeling. So it's the feeling, which is the representation of the emotion, that we become aware of. And we can become aware of a feeling almost automatically as that feeling happens. So you can become aware that you're feeling anxious, but you don't necessarily have started that emotion immediately prior to that. So it could be a lot of things triggering emotions, and then you become aware of some of those as they're represented as feelings. So the key then, if we bring that back to marketing, is what is the emotional response triggered by my brand? We know that everything has the capability to trigger an emotion or emotional response. So what we want to be able to understand is what is being triggered by my brand, because if we can understand that, then we can start understanding how we can go about changing that if we think we need to change it. And as Ken's talked about, we want to be able to understand also not just which emotion, but how important is that emotion in terms of driving purchase. So ways of going about measuring emotion, and there are different approaches depending on what we're talking about. Traditionally, and again Professor Roberts touched on this, a lot of work in marketing research has been focused on what is on the right hand side, because that's what we've been able to do, asking people to say how they're feeling. That does have some advantages. The advantages is that we can be quite specific, so we can list 15, 20 emotions and ask people exactly which ones they were experiencing. But what we know is that as we're doing that, we're bringing language into play and more thought and more thinking, so we're opening up cognitive bias. So that's the trade-off for getting more specificity.